how do you make that jump in your mind conceptually from the realm of evolution into something more synthetic like AI and the role that AST plays in it?
I think AI is probably the most important domain right now for consciousness research.
Mm,
I think it's where these issues are going to have to get worked out and resolved. I also think, practically speaking, it's the it's the place where consciousness research is going to have the biggest impact on us as a species, right? Because you could think of consciousness research, at least as it was previously, as well, philosophically fun, and it's interesting,
yeah.
and people can sit around and discuss it and write books about it, and this is sort of cool, but it doesn't really have a lot of practical implication, although maybe it changes your attitude toward the world, and in that sense shapes who you are as a person. But now something different is happening because AI, um, building intelligence, artificial intelligence that is potentially a trillion times smarter than any biological being ever was, is arguably the most significant transition in our species ever.
Yeah.
Like, never mind the invention of writing. Uh, this is the biggest thing going. But only if the stuff that we loosely think of as consciousness is buildable,
Hmm.
right? Otherwise, it's just a tool. It's just a big backhoe. It's like a backhoe for some intellectual labor. Uh, but understanding consciousness well enough to build it and understanding what that entails and what the risks are may well be the single most important thing that we do as a species. Right? So suddenly, consciousness research is way more than just a philosophical curio. It's everything. It's our entire future.
Mm.
So yeah, I'm very right now very interested in AI. Um, can we build AST? And if we do, what happens?
Right.
Does it make AI more prone to social cooperation, like we think in people these mechanisms do? Would it be beneficial? Maybe it would be, or maybe it wouldn't be. We better test it and find out. So that's definitely the kind of thing that my lab is interested in at the moment.
How would we go about measuring that, right? Because the difficulty with consciousness in general right now is it's kind of like, well, you're similar to me, and I feel like I have a conscious experience, so you probably have one, but the less similar you become, the less likely I am to give you consciousness as a property that you have.
Mhm.
We don't really have good markers or objective like litmus test to say something has access this experience
Yeah.
of information. Do we have anything, or is there anything I would say that is nascent or emerging, or some kind of like markers that we are starting to see that might be able to tell us this AI is getting something that's a little bit more than just computation?
Yeah. So um, there are people who are trying to come up with these markers.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're all on the wrong track because I think all of that way of thinking is predicated on the concept that consciousness is an essence that emerges.
Mm,
How do you measure the essence once it emerges? Right? And so you have this machine and you're like, well, it says it's conscious, but how do I know it has the feeling, the inner feeling? Right? And all of that is predicated on the same assumption that derails essentially every other theory of consciousness. The assumption that there's an essence, a essentially metaphysical or non-physical essence of experience that emerges. And then how does it emerge and how do we even measure it? And that way of thinking, I think, is fundamentally wrong, right? Because what we have, I think, are computational devices, machines, biological machines, brains that
mm-hmm.
build self models and access those self models and use them in order to guide themselves through the world and answer questions about themselves and so on. And when you ask those machines, are you conscious? They say yes, because that's what the self models describe themselves as having, right? So in the world of AST, all those components are in principle buildable, although they turn out to be very tricky and very difficult. And they're not straightforward, but in principle should be buildable and testable, right? Because you can test whether it has that model. And you can test, is it using that model? Does it build that information structure? Right? You don't have to ask, does it actually have a conscious feeling emerging out of it? Uh, it won't. It doesn't. It's just computation. But the point is, so are we. We're
Hmm.
computational machines. Uh, and so and just to add this, I don't think it's an accident that AI, like large language models like ChatGPT, are doing such astonishing things with respect to uh, language and very natural communication in a seemingly human-like way. It's because sure they're just computation, but they're taking the principles of the brain, neurons hooked together at synapses, and duplicating that in an artificial form. And it turns out that's a super powerful architecture for learning stuff, right? So they're mimicking the deep principles of the brain.
Hmm.